Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the report. The report today will be going over race ratings changes from today, and after that, we'll be discussing primary elections tomorrow. So first, I'm going to welcome on Eric Cunningham to join me to discuss our race ratings changes.
Hey.
Welcome, Eric. Happy to have you here. Can you just talk a little bit about first the presidential ratings and how our team is looking at the presidential race?
Yeah, definitely. So the two areas that I've been focusing on elections daily are the presidential ratings. I've also jumped into the gubernatorial ratings, but the presidential one, we kept our ratings the same for this bi-weekly edition. We're updating these every other week to ensure we have consistent ratings. So most of the ratings I felt really confident about last week. I think we were ahead of the ball on a couple ones specifically. But this week, I mainly focused on 4 in particular that I'm looking for in the future. Those states are Minnesota, New Hampshire, Kansas, and South Carolina. So the good news for Democrats is that 3 of these I could see in the future moving towards the Democratic column somewhat. We were reluctant to shift Kansas and South Carolina, like some other outlets, including our friends at the Crystal Ball, I believe, shifted those over to likely Republican from safe. The partisan lean of those states is so extreme that we felt it was imprudent to move them shortly. But recent polling has come out, larger numbers of polls from both of these states, that I think is lending credence to the idea that they could be more of a likely state than a safe state. To be clear, a safe is just a state that under no circumstances is going to flip, even like a 15-point landslide. A likely state is one that you could see a surprise, and we expect one candidate to win. We expect the candidate we predict to win by a pretty sizable margin, but it's not impossible that there's a surprise. So Kansas is important because it has actually a surprisingly large college-educated population, specifically in Johnson County, which is very suburban, growing, and becoming rapidly more liberal. The problem with Kansas is that the western portion of the state is so Republican and so rural that it's very hard for Democrats to compete. But polls have shown it within around a double-digit margin, not 20 points, not 15, closer to 10. And this is apparently consistent with internal polling from the Republican side that has shown a relatively close race. If Chris Kobach wins the primary for that Senate race, we may be in a situation where we not only need to shift the Senate race, but also the presidential race. For South Carolina, that's a state that's a little bit closer politically than expected, but it usually leans about 13 to 14 points to the right of the country, if I recall right. Donald Trump won it by a 14-point margin, so pretty substantial. But it has a large population of minority and black voters that are growing, as well as Charleston, which is becoming more liberal. So those 2 in particular are states that Democrats could see gains in or improvements in.
Yeah, I think that's all very interesting looking at it. And I wanted to ask you as well about a state that honestly has been trending towards the Republicans long term, but in and around Indianapolis has been moving to the left, which is why we have a competitive election for Indiana's 5th congressional district. But another state that the crystal ball moved to likely Republican on the presidential level was Indiana. Obviously, it hasn't voted for a Democrat for president since 2008 when it went to Barack Obama. So what's your reasoning for why Indiana statewide at least should stay at safe Republican?
So the problem with Indiana is that Harrison Griffiths wrote an excellent article about this, why Barack Obama was able to surprisingly win Indiana in 2008. And he actually won it by a better margin than he did states like North Carolina. He did very well in Indiana, relatively speaking. He did this by running up votes in the Lake County area. So what people call the region or the region. This is based around Gary, Indiana. And it has a lot of white working class voters and minority voters, mainly black. It's rooted with Chicago, so it's pretty liberal. Trump has made inroads there, and I don't see those inroads imploding rapidly. They kind of showed some consistency there. The other problem is that every county in the state, except for Hamilton County, has trended to the right over the last few decades. If you're since 2008. Even Marion County, where Indianapolis is from, the presence of Mike Pence on the ticket, who is from Indiana, gives a considerable home state advantage. Even if he wasn't beloved there, he's a well-known figure. So in order for Democrats to become competitive here, they need to either do 2 things. They need to pull absurd margins in not only Marion County, home of Indianapolis, and Hamilton County. They probably need to flip that county to even get it competitive. They need to do really well in the region. They also need to do well in the rural areas in downstate. which are trending Republican and managed to hold Republican even with the presence of someone like a moderate like Joe Donnelly on the ticket in 2018. So I get the idea of moving it because of that suburban decline in the fifth. I would caution against that because the fifth actually takes in a portion of Marion County that is Democratic at this point. If it took in southern Marion County, just kind of stretched around that way, it wouldn't be competitive. But the portion of Marion County that has is actually fairly liberal at this point, which is a big reason why it's becoming more competitive. Obviously, Hamilton County being there, home of Carmel, rapidly growing suburban area with a large protest vote. Um, Overall, I could see moving it, but it would be the very last of the states that I would look at and shift to likely Republican, if we're being honest.
Yeah, I mean, Indiana is a very interesting state, and I think the comparison
Mm-hmm.
between the 2016 Senate race where Evan Bayh lost his bid to reclaim his former seat to Todd Young, and if you compare that with the 2018 race where Mike Braun beat Joe Donnelly lost by a significantly smaller margin
Mm-hmm.
than Young did. Young lost by about 10 points. Donnelly lost by about 7 points, 52-45. Um, or it might have been 51-45 if I recall. But the point is, it
Yeah,
was
something like
closer,
that.
and coalitions were different as well. Donnelly managed to
Mm-hmm.
do 3% better statewide than Bayh did. And some will say that's because Donnelly was an incumbent. But the point is, if you look at the 5th district in Indiana, there was actually a pretty big improvement for Donnelly compared to
Yeah.
Bayh's margins there. And ironically, in the southern part of the state as well, where you have some traditional Democratic echelons, uh, the South, even though it voted Republican in 2016 for the Senate race, and Todd Young represented a district that took in a good chunk of Southern Indiana. Um, and you can see Donnelly visibly underperformed Bayh there
Mm-hmm.
in Southeast Indiana, even though he won by a greater margin statewide. And even on the side of the state in Vigo County, um,
Mm-hmm.
Evan Bayh won by double digits, 10 points around, and
Mm-hmm.
Donnelly only won it barely. And had Lucy Brenton, the Libertarian, not been in the race, you probably would have had Mike Braun winning Vigo County. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this is a county that swung from an Obama county uh, in 2012 to being a Trump county. Clinton didn't even get over 40% of the vote in Vigo
Mm-hmm.
County, and
Which is shocking.
it's been a bellwether for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but if Clinton underperformed Obama's margins there by such a large margin in 2016, it's still going to be hard to see Joe Biden winning the district, even if he manages to get 42 or 43% in the county.
Yeah.
Uh, Meaning its bellwether status could be worn out or expired at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually have family who are from that area, so I'm actually fairly familiar with Vigo County. But the big thing with Indiana is, if it were to be competitive, you would need to see Joe Biden combine the Obama coalition. He'd need to bring that back. He'd need to have the strength with black voters, specifically in
Yeah,
Lake and Marion counties, combined with
plus
that white
white working
working
class,
class appeal, mm-hmm. And the
and
suburban appeal around Hamilton County, because
yeah,
those
because
suburban counties were very red.
yeah, because at this point, if you look at some of the traditionally Democratic rural areas in
Mm-hmm.
southern Indiana, southeast Indiana, a lot of those areas are trending away from Democrats and have been for quite some time. So if Biden wants to win the state of Indiana, you'd have to do exactly what you said there and really boost turnout in and around the northwest portion bordering Chicago of Indiana and also around Hamilton County and the suburbs of Indianapolis. And even then, it would probably be tough considering how much of Indiana, like many of these Rust Belt states, is rural and Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
another
one other
thing,
thing, sorry, I was going to mention one more factor, which I think could hurt Democrats there, is the horrendously weak gubernatorial contest they have. 2008, Democrats are able to overcome the incumbent Republican Mitch Daniels, winning by a substantial margin in the gubernatorial race. This time, their candidate is polling in the mid 20s. There is a not unlikely chance that the incumbent Eric Holcomb wins 60 to 70% of the vote in Indiana, which at that point it's just another problem
yeah,
that we have there that
and with split ticket voting going down, especially in races that are up during the federal level years,
mhm,
at least recently, because we've become even more polarized, it definitely doesn't bode well for Democrats trying to win Indiana. I mean, it's certainly not a state they need to win, so I feel like they're not going to focus on it in November when they can win other states in the Rust Belt that, quite frankly, are going to be easier for them to win and
mhm,
more beneficial to their coalition. So that brings me to another point um, about Utah. And it's interesting because looking at Mormon voters, they actually fairly disapprove of Trump. and they
Hmm.
much prefer their new junior senator Mitt Romney to the president. And looking at that type of Republican, the Mormon Republican, makes one think about a congressman in Utah for like Ben McAdams, who's a Democrat in a traditional Republican seat, running against Burgess Owens. And a lot of people figured that Kim Coleman would be a better candidate than Owens, but there was a new poll out today that showed the race tied there. And it
Hmm.
really said that for McAdams to win, and we rate the race as leans Democratic because he still has a strong advantage in cash on hand. But in order for him to win, he would have to some extent, potentially use Biden voters in Salt Lake City. And it
Hmm.
talked about how he's tried to distance himself from Biden. But I was wondering, and this might blend in with our likely Republican rating in Utah, how much should a Democrat in Utah distance themselves from Joe Biden, given the fact that President Trump is fairly unpopular in the state of
Hmm.
Utah? And how
So
does the
yeah.
likely Republican rating impact your perception of who will win the state in November?
Yeah. So out of all the states that I mentioned in the likely column, the one that I think actually Democrats have the best shot in is Utah. And that's because of the raw percentage of votes Trump got last time. He only won 45 to 46% of the vote. So he's already starting with a pretty weak floor. The problem is Hillary Clinton only won 26% of the vote. You had 20% or so go to Evan McMullen, who ran a
Yeah,
conservative, independent, Mormon focused campaign, which played pretty well in Utah as well as in some areas in Idaho. The problem with the Salt Lake district in particular, because the district that Ben McAdams runs in has a large portion of Salt Lake City. It's kind of like what Asheville is in North Carolina's 11th district. It's a very liberal area surrounded by red.
yep.
So at this point, basically, you need to appeal to those voters, the Biden voters, the people who voted for Hillary, even when 3/4 of the state voted against them. You need to appeal to those voters, but you also got to appeal to the Evan McMullen voters. From information I've heard, uh, Biden's actually doing pretty decent with Evan McMullen voters.
It
That's
would
just
make sense given Trump's
Mhm.
approval from Mormon voters. I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, uh, we can't. I mean, I would have guessed a lot of those McMullen voters, and most of them would have gone to the Republicans back in 2016 before Trump was
Hmm.
fully tested. But even if that bodes true today, I mean, we still expect Trump to win, probably by a decent margin in Utah.
Yeah.
And he's going to overperform his percentage last time because there are still going to be a lot of those McMullen voters going over to his side. But
Hmm.
we could see a pretty strong performance for a Democrat in Utah compared to recent presidential elections, where obviously
Hmm.
President Obama and the Democratic nominees in the two elections before him just did not fare well there against
Hmm.
candidates that were all popular among Mormon Republicans.
Hmm. I would actually push back on Obama not doing well in Utah. At least in 2008, he did fairly well. You had that election was
I was
sandwiched
talking about
between.
2012.
Oh yeah, 2012. Sorry, because obviously 2008 he
Yeah,
actually
not
got over
2008.
30% of the vote, 34% of the vote, which is pretty remarkable. Um, the problem with Democrats in Utah is that they're not an anti-Republican state; they're an anti-Trump state. They've maintained their conservatism. They voted for conservative candidates down ballot. They voted for conservative senators and gubernatorial candidates. This time, we in the ratings we put Utah at safe Republican. Even if John Huntsman were to somehow run an independent write-in campaign, I would be confident keeping it at safe Republican. The state is just that. The Democratic base is basically just liberals in Salt Lake City. It's Protestants, white Protestants in Salt Lake City is actually kind of their biggest base. So I'm actually not shocked to see Burgess Owens doing a little bit better in that district than Trump will be doing. Keep in mind, this is a district I think that he didn't do horrendously in, but there was the state was just so odd in terms of how it voted that
Yeah,
kind of
that
makes it hard to
presidential election in
predict.
Utah was just incredibly wacky. And I
Hmm.
wouldn't use any congressional data from that presidential election to compare to this one time around because we
Hmm.
don't have any Mormon based third party candidate taking a significant block of the vote.
Yeah, because Evan McMullen's performance was the best performance a third party had in any state. It was better than even Gary Johnson did in New Mexico, I believe, by at
Mexico.
least twice as much as what he
Yeah, it
got
was quite
there.
significant.
Yeah, so that was just a unique appeal. Overall, I think Utah's going to be one of the more interesting states to look at, not just to see how Trump does there, to see if Biden can get that 35% marker, but also to see if this has any impact on down ballot races, which it doesn't appear it does. Mitt Romney, granted, there was a little bit of impact. Mitt Romney, when he ran in 2018, I do not believe he won Salt Lake County, which is pretty substantial given he won the county in 2012.
In 2012.
Um,
Yeah. And when I
yeah.
was talking about Obama earlier, I was referring to the 2012 performance where
Hmm.
obviously he fully underperformed by about 10 points from his 2000.
Hmm. Yeah. And for
But
those who would say
you brought
that,
up a good point about the 2008 margin there, which is pretty
mhm,
impressive for the Democratic
yeah.
candidate.
And for those who would say that the reason Mitt Romney did so well in Utah was because he's Mormon, kind of, but George Bush won 71% of the vote in Utah. He won Salt Lake County. It's not unusual for a Republican candidate to pull that percentage of the vote in Utah. They like conservatives, they like Republicans, and they
Yeah,
like specifically.
Obama's 2008 margin was the best Democratic performance in Utah since Bill Clinton in 1996, and even then it was a full percentage point better. So
It was very impressive. I mean, all things considered, which makes the decline even more shocking.
yeah,
I mean, if even Hillary Clinton was not able to recover even fully from that. She won 27% of the vote.
yeah, she
Obama
just
only won
slightly
24%.
overperformed Obama's
Yeah.
2012 percentage.
Yeah. It's just an interesting state to look at. I'm interested to see how things go there. It's one we're keeping an eye on, or at least I'm keeping an eye on in ratings.
And one more question about the presidential ratings, and that's looking at the state of Arizona. Could you see a lean Democratic rating coming soon, considering the Senate races rated as either leans Democratic by most pundits, or I think our Senate team has it likely Democratic. But looking at the presidential race there, no one can deny that Arizona long term, especially for in Maricopa County, is trending away from the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
The 2018 Senate race there showed us that 2016 presidential election there was closer than usual in Arizona. So, what's your justification for toss up right now, and how much would you need to see before you move it to leans Democratic?
Mm-hmm. Uh, at the moment, Biden has a small lead in polls. I believe it's around 3 to 4% in the polls, which actually isn't that unusual. I believe Donald Trump actually overperformed a little bit his margin in 2016. There, I could be wrong there, but the big thing with Arizona is what I need to see is I need to see not only consistency but also a larger margin. At the moment, moving it from toss up to lean Democratic only to see, for example, Biden's polling decline nationwide would make that rating a little bit of a problem. The big issue Democrats have in Arizona is the same problem Republicans have had in Minnesota. They've been able to consistently get 44 to 45% of the vote in the last few elections. The question is if they can get more. Most of the decline that Donald Trump saw, the Republicans have seen, has come from Republican vote share declining, not from Democratic vote share gaining. So, in
That's a
other
good.
words, what
That
I'm
is a very
yeah.
good point, because if you look at the 2012 election, comparing it to
Mhm,
2016, both Clinton and President Obama received 44% of the popular vote in Arizona.
mhm.
The only
Yeah,
difference why Arizona was closer in 2016 is instead of getting 52.5% like Romney did, Trump only got 47% in
mhm.
2000.
Yeah,
And
Democrats have gotten 44 to 45% of the vote in every single presidential election in Arizona since 2000. They obviously won the state in 96, so they've declined a little bit from that total. But it's the same problem
I mean,
Republicans have
if you,
had traditionally in Minnesota.
I mean, if you look at '96 too, their coalition has changed since then. I mean,
Hmm.
even back in '96, you still had. I mean, even in 2016, yes, Maricopa County was red, uh, but some would say that the 2018 Senate result there shows the long-term trends in Maricopa County are
Definitely.
going to benefit Democrats at least.
Hmm. That's what I keep. That's what I'm keeping my eye on in particular. Another factor is the mail voting. There's going to be a lot of mail voting in Arizona. We have no idea where that's going to go. Basically, just at the
What do
moment,
you think as well in Arizona a factor about Native American turnout for the Democrats with
That's going to be
coronavirus?
pretty big, actually. And the big thing in Arizona is actually that Trump actually overperformed a little bit with Native Americans relative to Mitt Romney. He did a little bit better with their vote. If you look at a lot of the counties, specifically in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, it's not shocking to see a little bit of a rise to him. I could see those voters returning to Joe Biden a little bit. Um, the question will be turnout, right? The Navajo Nation has obviously been hit with COVID like everyone else has. That's a major factor. Accessibility of voting areas is a problem. Mail voting in general is going to play a really big role. There's just too many factors for me in Arizona to move it to leans Democratic at the moment, even though the Senate race is very decidedly a Democratic advantage. We would be shocked if the result was any different. I don't think I can predict with confidence that either party would win this race at the moment.
Yeah,
That's just ultimately where I'm at.
I think that's a good point looking at Arizona, because it's definitely a state where you've got positive trends for Democrats like the rest of the Sun Belt, and Biden has been polling well there. But I guess I see your point. But just a quick, simple question. I mean, do you think there is a possibility going forward and that you could have a leans Democratic rating there?
Yeah, in the future, it's definitely possible. I would consider the 5% threshold to be pretty significant here. If it's consistently, if Biden is polling around 50%, um, then I would not be surprised, or that would be somewhere where I'd be more willing to move it. It just at the moment, there's a lot going on there that I just have trouble with. And also on a personal level, Arizona was the only state I got wrong for Senate in 2018. So that I'm kind of a little bit in that area as well as I don't want to repeat the mistake I made last time in that
Yeah.
projection.
And going on to look at our Senate ratings, I know Kraz and Adam are not here right now, but I think
Hmm.
we can both have a discussion on the Senate ratings. And first, I want to ask you about your home state in North Carolina,
Hmm.
where we've seen Cal Cunningham doing fairly well as a somewhat quiet candidate. Does not have, he's not very charismatic, if you know what I mean, looking at it that
Yeah.
way. But he has been fairly successful in polling and a decent fundraiser. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, a lean Democratic rating could be possible in the future. Um, but if we're looking real quick at the race as it is now, I think toss up is the most widely used rating.
Hmm.
It's rated as a toss up by all the major forecasters right now.
Hmm. Yeah. So the problem with North Carolina is that Cal Cunningham is polling very close to where Joe Biden is. He's polling identically. If you're voting for Joe Biden, you're voting for Cal Cunningham, is what the polls are kind of indicating. In fact, the most recent poll had them both at 48%. The difference was that Trump was down by 4, whereas Tillis was down by 9. And that's not a thing of Republican voters being like, yeah, Cal Cunningham's a candidate I can get behind. It's Republican voters not coalescing around around Tom Tillis. He's only polling with 80% of Republican voters in North Carolina, which is pretty bad. And again, that's not something where Cal Cunningham is doing better. In fact, if you look at the poll, the most recent one, Tillis is actually winning independents by 1% within the margin of error. Um, what I look at the moment is I think those Republican voters ultimately do come home to Tillis, but it's going to be a situation where Trump is probably going to need to carry him across the finish line. So if he's North Carolina is actually a state I would consider to be lower in the Democratic column. It's not an essential state for Democrats to win under any circumstance. If they're winning North Carolina, they've won the national vote. The question is how much they win North Carolina by. Um, so one other factor that Tom Tillis has that's problematic is he's not fundraising as well as Cal Cunningham. Cal Cunningham is not campaigning a lot, but he is fundraising a lot of money. And in North Carolina, a lot of money in North Carolina is a lot more than a lot of money in other states. We are a state with a history of having the most expensive Senate campaigns. You even go back to Jesse Helms versus Jim Hunt. That was the most expensive Senate campaign of all time. And then 2014 was the most expensive at that point. So I would not be shocked if it's the same thing here, although Arizona may beat it out. Tillis basically, if he wants to improve, if he wants to prevent this from going into a situation where Cunningham is favored, he needs to bolster his standing with Republican voters to the point where he's pulling even with Trump. He needs to considerably increase his fundraising, and he needs to make sure that voters know his positions compared to Cunningham's positions. They've been put out some decent opposition research lately on tax cuts that could play well in some of the suburban areas that shifted towards Democrats lately, specifically in Mecklenburg County, which actually voted in 2018 was a pretty bad year for Republicans in North Carolina, but Mecklenburg County voted for putting a permanent tax on the income tax, putting a permanent cap on it at 5%. So there's still a fiscally conservative trait in Mecklenburg County that he could kind of go after, which is his home base. He was from there. His Senate district was located in Mecklenburg County.
Mhm.
So at the moment, I would say it's on the verge of being leans Democratic. This polling lead for Cunningham is undeniable. The question is whether the polls are accurately reflecting the voters, whether these shy Trump voters or the shy Tillis voters that are reluctantly not backing him come around at the end. If they don't, that's going to be a problem, specifically for Tillis. I mean, he needs to do better than this. This is a pretty bad performance from him at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to 2014 and look at the polls, though, even though it was a pretty solid red wave, Kay Hagan was favored to retain her seat in the Senate for the entire cycle.
Hmm.
Even at the end there, that was rated as leans Democratic by the Crystal Ball and most other forecasters. So when Tillis won, that was considered an upset in general. And
He snuck
now he
across the yeah.
appears to be running a somewhat poorly run campaign against Cal Cunningham. And I feel like he could run a better campaign against Cunningham, but at the moment, the national environment doesn't look very good for him, and
Mhm.
campaign style doesn't look very good.
Yeah. So the thing with Tillis is that he actually lucked into in 2014 one of the worst decisions a candidate's ever made, which is that Kay Hagan decided to skip Armed Service Committee hearings to go to a fundraiser. If you know North Carolina, you know there's a large military population, specifically out in the east. Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune, there's a big military base in Elizabeth City. Like these are areas that are heavily military, and skipping committee hearings for fundraising was actually a big reason why he won. He snuck across the finish line, even though, as I mentioned before, Kay Hagan did everything he needed to do to win. She did pretty well in Western North Carolina in the mountains. She did really well in the east. She almost won a couple of counties like New Hanover. She did pretty well in the urban areas, and she still lost. That was not a credit to Tillis, apparently. That was a credit to Republican turnout in that red wave. This time, Tillis can't rely on that. He should not be waiting in the last minute, hoping that Cal Cunningham comes into a gaffe of that level. For one, because Cal Cunningham is not currently the elected
In
senator.
office, which
Yeah.
does help. Running
Mm-hmm.
a campaign without being incumbent does certainly help.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they're currently having. He serves one term as a state senator, and they're trying to dig whatever opposition they can come out of that one term. Outside of that, he has a pretty thin record, which is actually helping him at the moment. There's not a lot to attack him on.
Versus Tillis the other way around, where he can attack Tillis.
Yeah.
For I
Fundamentally, at the
suppose,
moment, yeah.
yeah. Sorry.
Fundamentally, at the moment, Tillis is going to have to hope for some strong debates. He's going to have to hope that some of these ads actually work out, and that he can convince those Trump voters, or that Trump can convince them that he is the better candidate for them. At the moment, I'm just not impressed with the campaign Tom Tillis has been putting on, or what either of them have been doing. Even though Cal Cunningham has an impressive lead, he's not doing any better than Biden. Basically, I think this is going to follow the presidential election pretty closely, which is
I would agree with
unusual.
that. I mean, I think it's unlikely if Trump wins North Carolina that you see a Cunningham victory. I think this is going to be a state with pretty low ticket splitting
Mhm.
this cycle between these races, personally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at it, we have so many races. We have 10 statewide executive offices, the Council of State.
It's kind of
And
comical, actually, how many positions there are in North Carolina that could be
mhm,
combined into one
yeah,
position.
yeah. But ultimately, the point is, a lot of them were coin flips. We had, I believe, 6 or 7 races that were within a percentage point, or 2 percentage points in 2016. That could be even more this time, given there's some vacancies. I expect the presidential and Senate races could easily fall into that category as well. And
Mhm.
that's pretty bad for people in North Carolina, because that means we're going to be having to watch ads for at least 12 different candidates, including our House representatives, the presidential race, the Senate race. It's
I
going to be a
think
barn
the
burner.
lieutenant governor's race there is one of my favorites that I'm going to be following between
Mhm.
Robinson and Yvonne Hawley, just
Yeah.
because of the two campaigns that they've been running. I think it's going to be interesting in that the two of them are going to cause it to be a nail biting race.
Yeah. I mean, very similar to 2012 when Dan Forrest was able to, or actually, yeah, 2016 or 2012 when Dan Forrest was able to narrowly win. Mark
I
Robinson
mean,
actually is a key, really excites Republican voters. I can tell you that there is not a single Republican I know who is not excited about Mark Robinson as a candidate. Um, at
and
least
just looking at North
Republican people.
Carolina,
Yeah.
even as Dan Forest's campaign is kind of melting down for the governor's office back in 2016, if you remember, I mean, I'm sure you do remember how competitive that election actually was for governor
hmm
2016 and how close the race was. So I think I would agree with that. We're going to see a lot of close races. And that
hmm
doesn't just go for a state like North Carolina. I think a lot of these Senate races are going to be very competitive. And when I
hmm
say very competitive, I mean essentially you could have a lot of them decided by 1 to 3 percentage points, maybe even some by less than one. And it's
hmm
kind of different from the last Senate cycle in 2018 because most of the competitive races on the map there ended up breaking by 5% or more, or by at
hmm
least 3% or more. I mean, West Virginia broke by about 2.5 to 3 percentage points Democratic. Same with Montana. Uh, if you look at states like North Dakota, it broke by about 10 points Republican. Missouri and Indiana by about 5 points Republican. Nevada by about 5 points Democratic. Arizona by about 2 points Democratic. Really, the only razor thin election uh, after Arizona was actually Florida, because that was
hmm
decided by 1/10 of 1 percentage point. And
hmm
obviously, you had recounts there in the Nelson Scott race for a long time. But looking at this map, there are certainly a lot of races that could come down to the wire on this map. In Montana, North Carolina, Maine, potentially Iowa. There also is the potential Arizona. A lot of people moved it back to leans Democratic because there was a poll that showed McSally at 46%, which is
Mm-hmm.
frankly the best that she's been the whole cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And
And she's
starting to,
fundraised pretty well.
yeah, starting to, a
Yeah.
lot of people originally were starting to think that Kelly had a chance to perform better than Hickenlooper, but at this point, it's possible that McSally manages to do slightly better than Cory Gardner just off of the fact that Arizona is still a less Democratic state than Colorado.
Mm-hmm. And one thing to note with Arizona, real quick, is that in any other state, Martha McSally would be putting up rock star numbers. She's been having really, really solid fundraising
She
numbers.
has been a solid
Yeah.
fundraiser, but
The
Mark
problem is
Kelly
that,
has
yeah,
blown that out of the water.
yeah, Mark Kelly is raising presidential money, and I don't say that lightly. He's literally raising that type of money. It's just
More
astronomical.
than many of the Democratic presidential candidates that dropped out.
Yeah, I mean it's really incredible, and that's a big reason why the race has been competitive. I've heard from inside specifically that some of the attacks on China have shown pretty well for them, but Arizona is just one poll isn't enough to convince me that something has fundamentally changed there.
Yeah, it is certainly a race where Democrats are favored, even if it tightens slightly from where it was a few months ago. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at it now, Kelly, even though his lead in the polls has supposedly tightened a bit, he still has a lead that's larger than Sinema did at this comparable point in the 2018 cycle.
Mm-hmm.
We made a house change today as well in California's 21st district. We moved it from toss-ups to leans Democratic. That district takes it to San Joaquin Valley. There's a rematch between Congressman T.J. Cox, who narrowly beat David Valadao in 2018. Valadao actually was leading by double digits on election night, but VBMs managed to put Cox over the line by 0.8 percentage points. We looked at various aspects of the campaign. It is true that Cox has had some problems in office. He's been accused of not disclosing aspects of his nonprofit and donations that made to political campaigns during his last election. But at the same time, it is a district that voted for Clinton by 15 points. And even though Valadao is an exceptional candidate who has been able to win, even as the district voted Democratic in presidential years like 2016 and 2012, we view Cox and his fundraising advantage right now as some critical aspects that put him as a narrow favorite for reelection, especially if Biden manages to convert his national polling lead into a polling lead that results in him winning some of these congressional districts by larger margins than Hillary Clinton. That certainly wouldn't help down ballot candidates like Valadao. So we're going to take a quick break real quick, and we'll be back after break with our analysis of the primaries tomorrow. I'll be writing an article that'll be coming out tomorrow, and then we'll all be back for election coverage tomorrow night. I also want to quickly talk to Ilya Berman. His comment was accidentally blocked for 5 minutes. That was unintentional. We apologize for that if you're still watching. I was looking at the comments and I was trying to see the settings and I accidentally clicked something that I didn't mean to click. So we apologize for that. We're going to go on commercial break and we hope you guys will stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to the report. This is the second half of our segment, and we're going to be talking about the key primaries tomorrow because this is the biggest primary night that we've had in quite a while now, in about 3.5 weeks. So we're going to be going over primaries in multiple states, including Kansas, Arizona, Missouri, and Michigan. And it's not just primaries. There also is a Missouri Medicaid expansion referendum. There's a similar one in Oklahoma that passed narrowly a few weeks ago. So we're going to start off with Kansas, and Eric and I are just going to talk back and forth, going through some of the key races. Elections Daily,
Mhm.
as you'll see in the article tomorrow, and on our primary coverage tomorrow evening, is covering 11 races in and at least one in each of those states. Um, First, we're going to be looking at the Kansas Senate Republican primary, which is widely considered probably the most watched primary tomorrow, largely because it will decide the Republican nominee for a Senate seat that um, isn't a typically Republican state like Kansas. So obviously, primary opened up when longtime Republican Senator Pat Roberts retired from the Senate seat. He announced that last April. Roberts faced a competitive election against independent Greg Orman in 2014. Polls actually showed Orman leading, and some people actually predicted an Orman victory. In the end, Roberts won by about a 53-42 margin, proving that his attacks connecting Orman to Senator Harry Reid, who was then the leader of the Senate Democrats, worked. They essentially compared him to a rubber stamp for Harry Reid and said that even though he was an independent, he could caucus with the Democrats, trying to pose a contrast there. And that's been synthesized to another Senate race this cycle between Dan Sullivan and Al Gross, and how Al Gross is going to distance himself from potential attacks from the Sullivan campaign, associating him with national Democrats. But
Mhm.
looking at Kansas again, Roberts retired, and that quickly opened up a competitive field in the Kansas Republican primary because, as you know, Kansas is a traditionally Republican state, and it has not elected a Democratic senator since 1932. A Democrat hasn't come close to winning the state in a Senate race since the 1974 Senate race, where then incumbent Bob Dole almost lost to Congressman William R. Roy. He won by about 0.5% after being considered too close to Richard Nixon following Watergate. So it certainly is a state where Democrats would have an uphill battle, but this cycle, Democrats have a candidate that is arguably a fairly good candidate, Barbara Bollier, a state senator. She has far outspent any of the prospective Republican contenders so far in the primary. She has raised $7 million and has $4 million on hand. The Republican contender with the closest amount to that is Roger Marshall, who, even though he hasn't fundraised as much as upstart businessman Bob Hamilton, he still has $1 million of cash on hand. And at the end of the day, cash on hand is more important than overall fundraising because that's the tangible money that you can use on the course of a campaign. But looking at the Republican field, you started off with quite a few more contenders than we have now. Susan Wagle, who is the president of the Kansas State Senate Chamber, dropped out of the race not long ago, and Jake LaTurner, who is the state auditor, dropped out and is now running against Congressman Steve Watkins in the second district. So we'll be talking about that race later. And you also had businessman Bob Hamilton enter the race not long ago, back in May. He's quickly risen to be a formidable contender. Actually, a new Daily Kos elections poll had him at 15% of the vote, which would put him at third place in that primary. But the two main contenders in this primary are certainly Chris Kobach, the 2018 gubernatorial nominee and former state auditor. He's also run for Congress before. And after that, you've got Roger Marshall, who is the establishment pick, and I can say that because he's been endorsed by former Governor Jeff Collier, who lost his primary as an incumbent to Chris Kobach. And more importantly, he's also been endorsed by Pat Roberts. Pat Roberts is the outgoing senator, and he said that Marshall, who represents the largely rural first district, will make a good fit for the state, and that he would be a better senator. President Trump actually endorsed Kobach in 2018, and his endorsement was one of the main reasons Kobach managed to narrowly beat Governor Collier in the primary. But this time around, President Trump has been notably silent on the race. He told his staff, according to CNN on Air Force One, a few days ago that he would not intervene in the race. He would not endorse anyone in the race in that primary until after the primary is complete. So this is effectively a compromise. He didn't endorse Kobach like he did last time, but he also didn't endorse Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans' preferred choice, Roger Marshall, to win the seat. So the real question is, looking at this primary, how will the coalitions form? We can expect Roger Marshall to do well out west in his first district. And there are a lot of Republican voters there. But when it comes to suburban Republicans in the second district and in the third district, which is more so Kobach's home area, the state in the east, the question is, how are those Republicans going to break? Are they going to vote for someone like Marshall, or are they going to vote for someone like Kobach, who the Republicans view as a liability both on the state and national level, given his loss to Laura Kelly in the 2018 governor's race? So I'm going to throw it to Eric real quick, and he can give us some predictions about the coalitions tomorrow, talking about where the Kobach voters will be, where the Marshall voters will be, how Bob Hamilton will do given his upstart candidacy, and generally who you expect to win tomorrow and how that will impact the general election there.
Mhm. So one interesting little tidbit I want to mention, just historical context here, is that the first district tends to produce senators. Three senators have come from the first district: Bob Dole, Jerry Moran, and Pat Roberts, the incumbent, who was retiring. This is because it touches every media market in the state. It touches Wichita, it touches Topeka, touches even Kansas City, and so it basically it gives you a little bit of a statewide platform, because running in the first district is kind of like running in a mini Kansas, just without all the Democratic areas. Um, uh, Obviously, for Republicans, they want Roger Marshall to win, or at the very least, they want Chris Kobach to lose. I think most are probably fine if Bob Hamilton won, but I don't see him doing, unless he pulls some sort of surprise, kind of like we saw in 2018 when,
Kind of like Mike Braun's victory
yeah,
over Luke
Mike
Messer
Braun.
and Todd Rokita.
You had two other Republicans in that primary who spent the entire campaign attacking each other, which allowed Mike Braun, who nobody knew, to just kind of come out of nowhere and win that primary.
And Hamilton is also a strong fundraiser because he's a businessman. So arguably, he would be a rather good candidate in the general election unless he had
Mhm,
some controversial statements of some sort, considering he'd be able to keep up with Barbara Bollier on fundraising.
mhm. I actually don't think the general election in this race will matter too much if it's not Chris Kobach.
Yeah.
Um, the one thing Republicans have with Bollier is that she is not. When she was a Republican, she wasn't a conservative Republican in the legislature. She wasn't even a moderate Republican. Her voting record was very, very liberal. It was to the left of the average Democrat in the state. Obviously, Kansas, you have a lot of moderate to liberal Republicans, but just because she's a Republican or a former Republican doesn't mean she's going to have a positive policy agenda that Republicans can really like. She does have a pretty liberal record in the legislature. The problem is that Kobach, I think there was a recent poll indicated that only 53% of Republican voters in Kansas would definitely said they would definitely vote for him, which is really bad. That's not what you want to see from a Senate race, even in a state as Republican as Kansas.
Yeah, that's not
There are
good.
probably there's probably a few states where you can win with 53% of the voters
Yeah, because
in.
if you only have essentially half of the Republican vote backing the Republican nominee, then the independent vote is probably breaking like 70 30 for the Democrats or something.
Mhm. Yeah. And I want to go a little bit back to 2014, which kind of gave Democrats a trial balloon in the state. Very similar candidate, Greg Orman. They actually cleared out their own candidate for the race. I've talked about the potential of this strategy, which I call strategic independence, where you run a front candidate as a an independent, and then hope they
Similar
win.
things happening in Alaska right now. I mean, the
Yeah.
Democrats
You,
don't have their own nominee.
Yep, and you've even seen that in either of the races. Lisa Galvin is an independent, and Al Gross is a Democrat. Both of them said they would caucus with the Democratic Party, and both of them fall squarely in line with the Democratic policy platform. But it gave him a trial balloon of what it would take to win a race in Kansas. Right? He came close, and then a term later, obviously had on the 2014 gubernatorial race was very close as well. Gave them a little bit more room to work with. Ultimately, I think there's momentum towards Marshall. I think the ads from the Sunflower State PAC, which Democrats are pumping these ads 24/7 to try and troll Republican voters into voting for Chris Kobach. I think that backfires. We saw a similar thing in the Democratic primary in North Carolina,
They tried
where
to. The Republicans were pushing for Erica Smith in
yeah,
that primary.
yeah, which you can see how well that's done right now. It's done absolutely nothing towards winning that race. Although it was kind of hilarious to see Erica Smith get 35% of the vote. It ultimately didn't matter too much when the candidate won. So I don't know if you take that as a sign of desperation, that an admission that if Kobach is not the nominee, this race is done, or if it's them just being genuinely confident, trying to keep that lead that Kobach has shown in the polling. Because ultimately his base is fairly small. He only won the primary in 2018 by 500 votes. Um, if he's winning with around 33% of the vote, there's a lot of Republicans who are going to be unhappy with that. At the same time, it is Kansas,
Yeah,
right? It's a very conservative state at every level.
and that is another thing if you look at it. I mean, the gubernatorial primary was very close, but this is different. This is a senatorial primary,
Mm-hmm.
and Trump hasn't endorsed Kobach this time. And it's true, Kobach has been ahead in the polls, but there was one poll that showed Marshall ahead of him with Hamilton in the race, and then there was another one that showed Kobach only up by
Mhm.
about 8 points, which was much smaller than his previous 20-point double-digit leads that he had over Roger
Mhm.
Marshall
Yeah.
at the beginning of this year, at the end of last year.
I think Roger Marshall could really surprise here because he's an incredible fit for the first district. He was able to primary challenge Tim Hillscamp, who was the former representative there. He
Yeah.
got kicked off the agriculture committee, and voters that's the unpardonable sin in the first congressional district is you need to be on the agriculture committee if you're so bad that you get kicked off by Republicans. That's why he won, and he's been very in tune with not only what Kansas Republicans in that area have done, but what Kansas Republicans have been historically, which is their candidates aren't flamethrowers at the Senate level, aside from Sam Brownback, who is obviously he wasn't even a flamethrower when he was in the Senate. He
And,
was a
and,
pretty
when
typical
you look
supply
at the
side guy.
western parts of these states, like Kansas, the first district, or Oklahoma,
Mhm.
Frank Lucas's district, sixth, you look at that, it's these Republicans, they aren't flamethrowers. You're right. Like Frank Lucas's colleague in the South, right below him, in a very similar rural agricultural based district. Um, I'm not going to say a moderate, but definitely a sensible conservative to the extent where
Mhm.
people like him and Marshall are at least tolerable from people that may disagree with them, at least respecting the fact that they're not more flamboyant like some of their other colleagues. I mean, you
Mhm.
see this sometimes with Democrats, um, moderate Democrats in narrow Clinton seats or Trump districts. They're not flamboyant progressive flamethrowers because they don't want to upset their base there. But this is an example of Republicans being in safe districts, which recently have been producing some more controversial candidates in primaries. But yes, both of them, you're right. I would consider them to both be fairly level headed. And I think that may help Marshall in the end, especially in a general election. The race
Mhm.
wouldn't be very competitive if it was anyone besides Kobach.
Yeah. And that is an important factor. I feel like I should explain this very quickly. Is Kansas is a Republican state, but it's not an overwhelmingly conservative flamethrower state. I like to consider it similar to Rhode Island. If you look at the Rhode Island state legislature, there aren't a whole lot of Republicans there. What Democrats are there are divided between conservatives and liberals. There are actually some Democrats in the Rhode Island legislature who would probably be Republicans in any other state, and it's very similar in Kansas. There are Republicans there who effectively vote like Democrats, and voters are fine with this. They like having a more moderate delegation there. So the question is whether or not Marshall is able to marshal, no pun intended, those voters out to the polls and get them to win. Being from that first district, I think, really will help him because he already has that base familiarity with the rural western portion of the state, which is just densely, overwhelmingly Republican. But also Wichita in particular is going to be one to pay
I mean,
or really close attention to.
another thing to watch that really helped um, Kelly in 2018, huge
Mhm.
margin in Johnson County, double
Yep.
digit win in Johnson County. I mean, if you remember that, even in the close gubernatorial race in 2014, Brownback still won Johnson County. Same on the Senate level.
Mhm.
Pat Roberts won Johnson County. And on top of that,
Mhm.
if you're looking at Ron Estes' district, if you look at Sedgwick County, that voted for Kelly as well. But that's not a
Mhm.
traditionally Democratic county if you look at it in
Yep.
terms of the 2014 elections. So if
Mhm.
Kobach's the nominee, there could be some bad things happening there for Kansas Republicans, and I know they're trying
Mhm.
to avoid that because they blew a winnable governor's race in 2018,
Mhm.
and they don't want to make that same mistake with the Senate level. And even though the Senate level is typically more partisan and voters are less open to splitting tickets than on the gubernatorial level, it would still be an underperformance for the Republicans looking at Kobach if he were the nominee. Now he would probably still end up winning because there is still a big disparity between splitting on the governor level and the Senate level, but it would be a competitive
Mhm.
race. It would be a lean.
Especially in Kansas. They
Yeah,
love ticket splitting there for governor.
yeah,
It's the
exactly.
Massachusetts of the Midwest in terms of voting for opposite party governors.
Yes. And I want to move on briefly just to touch on the Republican primaries for two Kansas House districts. In the first
Mhm.
district, you've actually got a race where you've got Tracy Mann, who's the former lieutenant governor of Kansas under the Collier administration. And the other candidate there is a county commissioner from Finney County named Bill Clifford. And those are the two main candidates. Clifford has actually been fairly competitive with fundraising. He's actually ahead of Mann on fundraising, even though Mann has more endorsements. And if you look at the district, whoever wins this primary will essentially win the general election because it is a very Republican district. And even though Tracy Mann has more cash on hand than his opponent, it's still worth looking at the fact that you could see an upset here. I mean, there's no polling, so there's not really any way to definitively state who the favorite is. I mean, a lieutenant governor, that is a statewide office. Sounds like he has more experience, but a local county commissioner could also bring some local politics to the table because at the end of the day, lieutenant governor isn't anything like governor. It's kind of like being vice president. You're just
Mhm.
the man who is close to being in charge of the executive branch of the state, but isn't. Uh, so whether or not his position as lieutenant governor seriously helps him out here is questionable. It's going to be interesting to look at this primary. And then the second primary is obviously the more closely watched primary. Even though the second district did vote for Trump by 19 points, this is definitely still a more competitive race than the first district. We still have it rated
Mhm.
as likely Republican. And this is a race between Steve Watkins and State Auditor Jake LaTurner, who was convinced by Kansas State Republicans, including former Governor Jeff Collier, to drop his Senate campaign to clear the field, which would help Marshall, and run against Steve Watkins, another person that has drawn the ire of the Kansas State Republicans, and who has repeatedly, there have been rumors that he's been tried to push down. So if you look at Watkins, he's pretty much been involved in some form of scandal even since he was running his campaign before he took office. He was accused of sexual assault before the campaign. He denied it, and he won in an upset victory over Paul Davis by just 0.8%, very close race, but his victory was still significant because the race was rated as leans Democratic. A lot of people expected Paul Davis to win, and it was one of the few upsets that actually broke towards the Republicans in that seat after Lynn Jenkins retired. Because you had a lot of other seats like the 5th District of Oklahoma, South Carolina 1. Those were good examples of upset races that broke towards the Democrats, or New York 11 with Max Rose. But the second of Kansas was one that broke towards the Republicans. And very soon after getting into office, about the fall of 2019, Watkins, there were rumors spreading, and Daily Kos reported this, that he was going to resign for unknown reasons. And this followed the sexual assault allegations, which went nowhere. And this related to essentially allegations that he was trying to be pushed out by Kansas State Republicans. And the biggest bombshell after LaTurner entered hit this summer when you essentially had just last month uh, Congressman Watkins was charged with 3 counts of voter fraud in the 2019 municipal elections, and his father is also investigated. That's not good. That's now 3 scandals, essentially, and voters may have a lack of confidence in their congressmen at this point. I mean, we can't know for sure how the voters will go. There isn't any Trump figure endorsing in this race, like the Senate race, so no one to save Steve Watkins as a congressman. And even though he's been narrowly outraising Jake LaTurner. LaTurner actually has more cash on hand than Watkins at the moment, according to the latest FEC numbers. So
Mhm.
before the voter fraud scandal, there were some people who still thought Watkins would be able to take enough votes to hold his seat in the primary, but now he's definitely viewed as more vulnerable. And if he loses his primary and no one else loses their primary this week, he would be the 6th incumbent to lose a primary. I mean, you've already had Steve King, Dan Lipinski, Elliot Engel, Denver Riggleman. And if you look at those races, I mean, a lot of them were incumbents that either were out of touch with their district, like Elliot Engel, someone who was perceived when Jamal Bowman beat him as someone who wasn't connected closely enough to the district. You had people like Steve King, who were a liability for the Republicans, and a popular state senator like Randy Feenstra was able to dispatch him, and he was known for his white nationalist comments. You had Scott Tipton, again, didn't spend any money on advertising and lost out of the blue to Lauren Boebert in Colorado. And then, of course, you had someone like Dan Lipinski, the other Democrat who lost a primary this cycle, who uh, was arguably too conservative for his district. I mean, there are a lot of working class white voters in the district, but he underperformed against Mary Newman in a rematch in the Chicago portion, and he lost narrowly. So if you look at that, this would be the first real loss because of a scandal. None of the incumbents who have lost at this point have lost because of a scandal. They've either lost because of controversial comments, lack of touch with the district, not focusing on their campaign in the case of Tipton, or in the case of someone like Engel, just losing touch with the district and being perceived as someone who was stuck in Washington but not back at home. But Watkins would be the first person to lose for an outright scandal, because even someone like Steve King made a bunch of horribly racist, controversial comments over the years, but it wasn't a scandal. He wasn't formally charged with committing a crime like Steve Watkins has been. So it's going to be
Mhm.
interesting to see what voters do, whether they're going to quote unquote indict Congressman Watkins by sending him out of office in this primary, or if they're going to decide to keep Watkins, in which case he would arguably still be a favorite despite his scandals for the seat, because
Mhm.
Michelle de Isla is not doing well in fundraising, fairly poor fundraiser, actually trailing both Republican candidates in fundraising. It's a seat that voted for Trump by 19. And even
Mhm.
if it votes for Trump by only 13 to 15 points this time, that's still a very difficult margin to overcome in a presidential year if you look at
Mhm.
ticket splitting. And ticket splitting between federal races in Kansas isn't as pronounced as it is between gubernatorial and state races and federal races.
Mhm.
So if you
And
look at
we
that,
yeah.
De La Isla essentially would definitely have a much better chance against someone like Watkins. She was actually leading him in a Republican internal poll. But even then, I think that poll is being a bit too rosy for the Democrats, considering a candidate like Paul Davis, who was a fairly good candidate, couldn't win the seat against someone like Steve Watkins, who arguably was never a very good candidate from the start.
Mhm. And if you recall, this is the district, if I recall right, that was Nancy Boyda's district, the former
It
Kansas
was.
and she was elected in the blue wave in 2006, and it was one of the few Republican victories in 2008 because the seat
And
is
it
just
was also
it's
one
so
of the
red.
few Republican gains in 2008. If you look at that, I mean, she lost
Mhm.
re-election after just a single term in 2008, and there are usually a lot of reasons for that. I mean, you had other Republican gains. Obviously, Joseph Cow in Louisiana, the New Orleans area, flipped his seat over Bill Jefferson, but that was because of a scandal. Jefferson
Mhm.
was viewed as a tainted incumbent, and that turned out to be one of the few seats to flip to the Democrats in 2010. Then you had another one like Tim Mahoney in 2008 in Florida. That was Mark Foley's district, and he obviously had to resign because of his sexual dealings with underage male staffers. But Mahoney couldn't hold the district because he only won in a fluke over a candidate named Joe Negron by about 3 points. And part of
Mhm.
the reason that probably damaged Negron's campaign was Mark Foley's name was still on the ballot as the Republican nominee. And even then,
Mhm.
Mahoney only narrowly won. But
Yeah.
just some extra trivia there. But it's true. I mean, Boyda was
Mhm.
briefly running for Senate this year, but she dropped out. And since her loss, she hasn't really done anything in
Yeah. It's
politics.
yeah. I mean, Democrats, the big thing they have with this is the seat has Topeka, Kansas, which is a fairly moderate city, and it has Lawrence, Kansas, which is one of the most liberal cities in the Midwest. Um, but even with that, it's a Trump plus 19 seat. Steve Watkins
It's
is a
going to be
candidate who
very
really,
tough.
yeah,
It's what I said in the
yeah,
article. It'll be an uphill battle. Uh, I honestly still don't think the internal poll there is
hmm
incredibly accurate, even though it was a Republican internal, and usually losing your internal is a bad sign.
yeah,
But it would have to take a pretty impressive Biden landslide, like FDR levels, to really win that district. And he's
hmm
definitely not winning that district. But the question is, how many split ticket voters will there be between the presidential contest and the local contest?
hmm
And if LaTurner is the nominee, that makes it even better for
hmm
Republicans and can move it back to likely Republican, kind of like getting rid of a liability like Steve King.
hmm Yeah, this is just another example of poor Republican recruiting in safe districts. This
Yeah,
district is
which
competitive.
plays the
Um,
Republicans. And
yeah, specifically in Kansas, but apparently everywhere now, where this district should not be competitive, and because of a self-owned recruiting failure, it's in a situation it shouldn't be in.
yeah, and we're going to move on to Michigan real quick. We've got some primaries to talk about here. In the third district, obviously, the third district is known uh, as the seat of Justin Amash, who famously switched to an independent and voted against President Trump. He voted to impeach the president with Democrats. And he later switched to Libertarian, becoming the Libertarians' first member of Congress, and then announced his retirement from the House. And this all came after a short lived Libertarian presidential bid. And if you look at the district now, a lot of us wanted to see a three-way race because that would have been interesting to see if he could be the first elected Libertarian Party member of Congress. But now we've got a one-on-one race in this typically Republican district, which has prompted us to move it back to likely Republican because it does have a city like Grand Rapids in it, essentially, which is trending towards the Democrats. But at the same time, it's still a Republican district on paper. And it was held by a Republican named Vern Ehlers for a long time until Amash won it in 2010. And, regardless of whether the Republican nominee is Peter Mayer or Lynn Afendoulis, it should be a seat that's held by the Republicans. It would take a lot to flip this district. Arguably, the 6th district would flip before this district, and Fred
Hmm.
Upton's still a very strong incumbent in the 6th district. But looking at the primary here, it's between Peter Meyer, who's a former veteran and businessman. He's an heir to the Meyer family. I believe it's a food company. I don't remember fully correctly about that. And he's running against Afendoulis, who has the support of conservative women's organizations like Susan B. Anthony List, Maggie's List, that want to elect more women to Congress. And she has the endorsements of about 30 fellow colleagues in the state house. And she was originally viewed as a favorite, but Peter Mayer, and the reason why we view him as a potential favorite now, he was leading 41-17 in a poll a few days ago, and that's a pretty lopsided margin. So this is going to be an interesting primary to watch. It's going to be interesting to see um, how both candidates compete against each other, and whether or not money and a strong polling lead can outdo a candidate who has a strong local presence like Afendoulis and a lot of fellow endorsements from the Michigan legislature.
Hmm. Yeah, and Peter Mayer is the type of candidate who could not only win the district, but probably win it for quite a while. Joe Szymanski did an interview with him, and his interview was uh, he has some interesting positions that are a little bit to be unexpected of a Republican. So he's not running as a hardline Trumpist candidate in a district that's not quite at that level. Um, but either way, we think this district is going to be Republican favored in the end. Even with the current situation in Michigan
Yeah,
with polling being pretty weak for Republicans in the state overall.
yeah, and then the other two races we're following. One of them is in the 10th district, which is takes in the Michigan thumb. Hasn't been represented by a Democrat since David Bonnier held it in the early 2000s, back when he was in the House leadership. But it's been Republican since then. Congressman Paul Mitchell is retiring this year. He announced that last July. And the Republican primary now is between State Representative Shane Hernandez, Lisa McClain, who's a financial executive, and Doug Slocum, who is a former brigadier general in the U.S. Army. So you've got a close race there. And the polling backs up the fact that this is close. Shane Hernandez, in a WPA intelligence poll, same poll that polled the 3rd district primary, Hernandez was at 33%, McClain was at 27%, and Slocum was at 10%. So once again, kind of like Kansas won, this is a primary where the winner of this primary will go on to be the next representative. It simply isn't competitive for Democrats anymore. In fact, it flipped right after David Bonnier retired back in 2004. If you look at endorsements, Shane Hernandez has the support of Paul Mitchell, the outgoing congressman, along with Kevin McCarthy, the House leader. He also has support from the Club for Growth PAC and Gun Owners for America. McClain, on the other hand, has an endorsement from Maggie's List, the same pro-Republican women's organization that endorsed in the 3rd district for Afendoulis. And the only real endorsement for Doug Slocum, who's in last place in the polls, is a Michigan Right to Life Pact, and then former Governor Rick Schneider, who held the governorship before Gretchen Whitmer.
Hmm. And that's probably not an endorsement you want at this point.
No, probably not. If you're looking as well, if we want to go on to arguably the most watched primary in Michigan, definitely the only real competitive Democratic primary in Michigan is in the 13th district. And, this is a primary between Rashida Tlaib, who is the incumbent representative, and arguably, after Ilhan Omar, the most controversial Democrat in the caucus, um, and former Representative Brenda Jones, who was formerly president of the Detroit City Council, is running for the House seat. Now, she did hold this House seat. She won a November special election last year to hold the seat until January of Rashida Tlaib. And this was the seat of John Conyers, who was the dean of the House for a while, that had to resign following allegations of sexual promiscuity. So um, if you look at this primary, Jones held the seat for a few months from November until January, and then Rashida Tlaib, who was elected on the same day, took over for the full term beginning on January 3rd. So Rashida Tlaib has been, as I said, arguably more controversial than Ilhan Omar, and certainly in the more controversial when you're looking at members of the Progressive Squad that was elected in 2018. Um, and I mean, on her first day in office, she basically said "F the president," and that garnered some controversy. And that was
Hmm.
really the first thing that she did that drew the ire of conservatives. Obviously, conservatives aren't part of the electorate in the 13th, but If you look at the Democratic primary here, there have been a significant block of Democrats nationally who've called her out for being anti-Semitic, largely following a controversial comment about the Holocaust that was sometimes misreported, where she supposedly said it gave her a comforting feeling. Now, she didn't. She's tried to say that she wasn't talking about the Holocaust
Hmm.
itself, but the fact that the Jewish people were given their own country in Israel following the Holocaust. But the comment did not play well, and it's just added to more allegations that politicians like her and Ilhan Omar are somewhat anti-Semitic, at least in a closeted way. And it's going to be interesting to see, considering the district is a VRA seat. There are a lot of minority voters in the seat, whether or
Hmm.
not they elect Jones in the primary over Tlaib. I mean, Tlaib is expected to win. She does have the support of the rest of the squad, as well as Bernie
Hmm.
Sanders, progressive Abdul El Sayed, who was known for running against Gretchen Whitmer last time as well, and Nancy Pelosi. But the Pelosi endorsement should be taken with a grain of salt because the Speaker of the House always has to protect incumbent caucus members. That's just how it goes. The House leadership is not going to endorse a challenger to an incumbent, regardless of how controversial that incumbent may be. And two polls by Target Insight, small sample size, about 5% margin of error, showed the first one showed Talib leading Jones 43 to 34. The second one showed her leading 52 to 24. Both of those polls had over 20% undecided, and with a margin of error of almost 5%, that effectively could mean it goes either way, depending on which way the undecided breaks. So we could argue that Talib's a favorite. In fact, I personally believe she probably will be able to hold on to her seat tomorrow in the primary, but it is a possibility that Brenda Jones wins tomorrow. And one thing that's brought up repeatedly is Talib's refusal to endorse Joe Biden, even though Biden is popular with African American voters who make up a significant part of the district. And Biden also won this district in the Michigan primary by a fairly large margin in the Democratic primary earlier this year. So, what do you think about this district, Eric?
Hmm. Definitely. I mean, I think at the moment Talib is favored. Brenda Jones has not been able to kind of put this thing away. She has her own scandals to begin with, some other stuff involving her, and the fact that Democrats have pretty much resoundingly supported Rashida Tlaib is a big deal. Going forward, I'm not sure it actually matters too much because Michigan's set to lose a congressional district, which
Yeah.
means this district will be redrawn. And will likely now. Granted, there's ways it can be done. For example, if I recall right, I don't believe the district has Dearborn, Michigan, in it, which is
Oh.
actually one of the largest areas of Arab support, which would be somewhere that Rashida Tlaib would like to have in a district. But basically, I've not seen anything that indicates that Brenda Jones is going to be able to win over the district, despite the general feeling that Tlaib was kind of a fluke candidate last time, right?
And it's certainly possible, but the real question is in redistricting, especially if Democrats manage to take control of the legislature of Michigan. Would they consider just drawing out a Republican incumbent and keeping Tlaib, or would they draw Tlaib into another seat? Would they draw Tlaib in with Brenda Lawrence? That would be a probability because they're not going
Mhm.
to interfere with Debbie Dingell, considering her clout in the caucus there in the congressional delegation for Michigan. But it is possible to see them drawing her into Brenda Lawrence's seat if they had to combine the seats. Now, the question is, um, Michigan, is it allowed to have only one VRA seat, or is it
Mhm.
mandated to have two VRA seats?
That's the question, and whether or not a VRA seat is defined in this case as being able to have 50.1% or
Or
50.1%
whether or not it could
minority
just be a
population.
plurality black opportunity seat or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Which you could easily draw something like that. I've in my
You
own
can, but it's
redistricting
very
drawn.
tough with
Yeah.
the current 2018 population
Hmm.
data to draw two full-on majority black
Yeah.
seats in
Very,
Michigan.
very tough.
Very,
If not,
very hard.
yeah. I mean, and keep in mind it's going to be drawn by an independent commission, so that's another factor to consider here.
Yes.
Incumbency, in theory, will not matter at all. So it's not like Talib can go, "Hey, I want a better district." It's ultimately
And
her
even if
vote.
it were that
Yeah.
way, she wouldn't have very much bargaining power considering she's the least senior or
Hmm.
tied with Andy Levin for the least senior Democrat in the delegation.
Hmm. Yeah, it's she's in a weak position right now. It's the same problem Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in theory could have had in New York, although the increasing loss of Democrats in New York has kind of made it easier for them to keep her around because there will be Democrats less senior than her this
And it's
time.
going to be interesting looking at New York in terms of how they're going to do redistricting because New
Mhm.
York is losing two seats in redistricting this
Yeah,
cycle.
at the moment is what it looks like, which is
And if
seismic on
population
top of
statistics
yeah.
continue to change, there is a possibility for three, and that would be very detrimental to Democrats, because at the most they could try and get rid of one Republican, but they'd still have to sacrifice two Democrats. And
Yeah.
whether or not they'll take Jamal Bowman, considering he'd be very, at least senior in the delegation there, we don't know yet. Or whether or not they're going to fortify Maloney and draw a new seat for Suraj Patel, considering Maloney's now the chair of the Oversight Committee since Elijah
Hmm.
Cummings died. It's going to be interesting to look at New York. But just to get back on topic, we're going to briefly talk about Missouri and then go to Arizona to wrap up the report. In Missouri, Lacey Clay is facing a rematch against Cori Bush, a progressive that challenged him last time. He won by a large margin last time. Keep in mind, this district is in the St. Louis area. It's heavily Democratic, takes in St. Louis City and parts of the county. Um, and the district is Democratic. It is also majority black. It is a VRA seat. And
Hmm.
Cori Bush is running again. The question is, in a generally anti-incumbent year, we've seen the most incumbents defeated in primaries or conventions in Riggleman's case in a non-redistricting year since 1980. Is it possible that we lose more incumbents this time? Is Lacey Clay going to lose? I don't think so. Is it possible? Who knows? Especially after someone like Scott Tipton lost completely out of the blue. Uh,
Hmm.
we did see Mary Newman perform better in a rematch primary challenge. Obviously, she won this time. She didn't last time. But that was a close race in 2018, and this one wasn't. So you'd have to see a pretty large jump in support for Cori Bush for Lacey Clay to lose.
Yeah, and also one other thing to keep in mind is that Lacey Clay has the Clay name. His father, Bill Clay, represented the district for a very long time in Congress. So he has a bit of a family history, or kind of like if you remember uh, a district in Tennessee, you had Harold Ford. His father had represented the district.
Even
It's a
in
very
New
similar
Jersey, in
dynamic
the
here.
majority black 10th district, Donald Payne Sr. represented
Hmm.
the seat before Donald Payne Jr. took over after his death um, in, I think, 2012. So if you look at that, there is definitely a name factor involved in that. I mean, even in seats that aren't majority black, like Lipinski's seat, his father represented it before him. And one thing that Miles Coleman brought up in his article for the Crystal Ball was a lot like Dan Lipinski kind of got Madigan to include him on the ballot to replace his father after his father essentially dropped from the race and retired. Lacey Clay, kind of similar. He procured the seat from his father in that way. So it's going to be interesting
Hmm.
to watch. Now, the difference is, you know, Lacey Clay, his voting record fits the district, is considerably more liberal than his opponent than Lipinski was in the third district. Lipinski was
Hmm.
viewed as too conservative for his abortion position and various other positions that caused conflict with some traditional Democratic primary voters.
Hmm.
Um,
I mean, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to look at because this is one of those rare attempts you're seeing from the progressive wing of the party to challenge an incumbent Democrat from the left in a congressional black district or congressional black caucus candidate, right? You haven't
yeah, I
seen so
mean,
much of the
you
specific
saw it
challenge
earlier this
before.
year in Ohio with Joyce Betty, and she pretty much
Hmm.
easily dispatched her challenger there. So,
Hmm.
real quick, moving on to Arizona as we wrap up. There are three primaries we're following in Arizona. First, in the first district, Eva Putsova is challenging the co-chair of the House Blue Dogs, Tom O'Halloran. She's a former Flagstaff city councilwoman, and she has been endorsed by brand new Congress, among other things. O'Halloran is still, in our opinion, a strong favorite to win renomination, but it will be interesting to see how much Putsova garners in terms of votes in that district. Looking at the next district we were looking at was the fourth district with Paul Gosar, who is a controversial incumbent. He is very conservative, and it is a very conservative seat that he represents, the fourth district
Hmm.
of Arizona. But he's facing Anne Marie Ward, who is actually a former staffer to Senator Martha McSally and small business owner. So that's going to be interesting to see if he survives that. And then last but not least, in the sixth district, which we have rated as lean Republican, and I'm proud that we put it at lean Republican before Schweikert admitted to essentially illegally giving himself an upper hand over Ben Quayle in his 2012
Hmm.
redistricting primary to the Ethics Committee. And that's between Anita Malik and Haral Tipernini. Um, and Tipernini was the nominee in a special election last time against Debbie Lesko, and now she's in a rematch against Anita Malik, who was the sixth district nominee here last time.
Hmm. Yeah, that's going to be a fascinating district to look at because Quayle is obviously very angry about this. When the
Oh
district's
yeah, I mean
redrawn,
he
yeah.
only narrowly lost. He essentially cost him his seat by one
Mhm.
point.
Well, the way he put it, and basically the context here is that Arizona had an independent commission which redo the districts in 2010. This included putting Ben Quayle and David Schweikert in the same district. And in the last week of the campaign, according to Ben Quayle, Schweikert was out of money. Like, he just didn't have any. This is where that money came from, the illegal money that he admitted to taking at this point, and what put him over the edge in a very close primary. This is one of those districts we talked about in the map room. It's one of those districts that Democrats are looking to expand their share in. And it's one that's it's right to look at this district because, like a lot of the rest of Metro Phoenix, there are specific elements here about this district that make it a good target for Democrats. They're growing among specific demographics in all of the collar suburban districts in Phoenix, which I believe is the 5th district. So the two, the one that Debbie Lesko's district, David Schweikert's district, those are two of the big ones where there's specific problems with demographic voters in that area. So it's a good one to keep an eye on.
In the 4th district, is it possible we see a reverse Lauren Boebert? So instead of a sensible conservative losing to a more controversial far right conservative, we see someone who is one of the most conservative members of Congress losing to an untested, I could say, less controversial conservative.
That would be funny to see, but I doubt it.
One
thing about rural Arizona Republicans is they are very, very, very conservative. That's why I'm actually interested to see the margins in the Senate primary, because you have a candidate against Martha McSally, Daniel McCarthy, who is not a serious candidate, but there are people on the fringe right of the party, which is pretty substantial in Arizona, that are trying to push for a protest vote for him. I'd be interested to see where those votes come from. I anticipate if there are a lot of them, they would come from the 4th district. It's the most rural stretches in some of the most Republican areas in the West.
I mean, this is where they had the Lake Havasu boat parade for Trump.
Yeah, I would be shocked if Gozar even comes close to losing this district.
Yeah, I do have a hunch in the back of my mind after the Colorado 3 race that we could potentially lose another incumbent, and maybe even 2 in this primary cycle.
That'd be interesting.
I mean, Watkins is definitely the most vulnerable. After that, probably Tlaib. But will there be another one out of the blue? We don't know. Could it be Lacey Claire, Gosar? It's possible, but again, there's no polling data, so nothing to suggest anything like that. But then again, there was no polling data to suggest that a Lauren Boebert would beat Scott Tipton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, unless there's some factor like she had where she was the only person on the airwaves. I'm not sure if it's the case in the 4th district. I know Gozar is pretty well known in the area, pretty active, and has kind of garnered a lot of sympathy from Republicans.
Arguably, I mean, they were both in Congress since 2010.
Mm-hmm. He's also got a lot of sympathy from some Republicans on the right because of the attack ad that was put against him last cycle, where his Democratic challenger. Yeah, and a lot of Republicans saw that as a really, really low blow. So I want to see how it goes, but I would be shocked if it's close.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that concludes our section of the report. You'll see a review article going over all the primaries tomorrow, and please tune into our live election coverage tomorrow at night. We're going to be back first time in a few weeks, and we're going to have some new graphics and some new projections. And it's going to be different this time. We're going to have new panelists. It's going to be newer. It's going to be better, and it's going to be closer to what we have in November. So make sure you tune in tomorrow night. We'll have more information on that soon.